Ladies and gentlemen, friends, hello, welcome. I will introduce. I'm very glad to have you all joining us. I'm so used to my own Zooms where I see everyone, and I realize that we just keep learning this new technology. So first, I'd like to welcome you all to our conversation this afternoon on color, light, and atmosphere with gallerist Edward Cella and artist Chris Trueman. Edward Cella is the founder of his eponymous gallery, Edward Cella Art and Architecture, representing an important and transformational cohort of mid and late career artists, architects, and internationally renowned estates. Edward and I started collaborating, and I started representing Edward about a year and a half ago. In addition to his exhibitions in our Pacific Design Center location, Edward has worked with many of our design clients sourcing art, whether it's a single piece, a commission, or an entire project. So it's a wonderful service that Edward is offering. And if you haven't met Edward, he's very smart and great fun to talk to. The conversation is being presented in conjunction with Absence of Light, Absence of Atmosphere, Chris Trueman's latest and third exhibition with Edward Cella Gallery. The body of work presented marks a new relationship of the artist practice with the light and space movement, which is so indelible to the West Coast. The works are on view in our Pacific Design Center showroom, are punctuated with reversals of the figure and ground relationships and saturated with atmospheric spectrums of color. And they'll be on the walls through April 4th. So please reach out to Edward or myself and make an appointment to come in. Although really you should do it with Edward because he's much more charming and knowledgeable than I am. Chris exhibits regularly in the US and is represented by galleries throughout California, in San Diego, San Francisco, as well as Washington, DC, and Brisbane, Australia, which sounds wonderfully exotic. The broad interest of Chris's work is reflected in his more than 35,000 followers on Instagram, which is a contemporary measure of the metal by which we are shown in the social world. Trueman's new exhibition marks a new relationship in his practice with light and space movements. And I think with that, I will start with the first question and then turn it over to Edward. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction.
Thank you. Chris, why is the legacy of the light and space movement so lasting, and what about it continues to inspire artists and collectors?
Well, when I think about light and space, I think about a transitional and an impermanent space that we're dealing with. During grad school, I used to go over and I would sit underneath the James Turrell sky space, and I would watch the sky as it moves by, juxtaposed against the LED lighting that hits the structure. And and I think it made more of an impact on me than I realized at the time. But what really caught my eye and got me thinking now was the relationship between this sort of idea of temporality. This idea that things are constantly in flux and constantly in change. And and over the last year, I think it's been even more clear that that there's a certain instability about life, and we're constantly evolving and changing and adjusting. So thinking about that on one hand, and then thinking about the relationship between technology, how we're viewing the world these days through sharing photos and pictures and Instagram, and through the screen light as well. And finding myself in between, finding myself both aware of the natural environment around me, and especially in Southern California with this history, but also, looking at the future, looking at technology and looking at these more virtual spaces.
Great answer. Kathleen, we have a slide of the Turrell space, and maybe bring that up on the PowerPoint so we can have an image of that as we kind of continue that conversation. Because I think it's such a, first of all, since the beginning of time, humankind has been looking up into the stars, looking at the sun, the phenomenal light effects that happen above us. And it's something that is, I think, light and space artists are constantly tap into, is a sort of wonderment of the universe around us. And it is about the sort of phenomenon of this incredible thing that the phenomenon that happens. And you know, in the Renaissance era, there was an interest in the sort of scientific, and the Enlightenment brought us these things, this sort of understanding of light and color and spectrum, and beginning to sort of think of it as a scientific exploration. But you know, here in California, the California artists, you know, we're surrounded by this light and by this phenomenon. And you know, to me, it's one of the things that sort of, it speaks to both location and site and culture, but it also kind of speaks to a time and an era. And I'm curious, you know, you mentioned this particular artwork, which is in Pomona, and you know, it's a socially distant artwork to experience, so go visit it.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm curious, you know, Chris, what, you know, when was it that you saw this? And I'm curious, the photograph that's on the screen right now kind of talks a little bit about something that really connects to your work. I'm curious if you can maybe decode that for us a little bit.
Sure. So I saw it first when I was in grad school at Claremont Graduate University, you know, which is connected to Pomona College through the consortium. So what we're looking at here, the blue around the square, is a projected LED light that is projected up from the beams that hits this structure, and the gray space, it's currently gray, is the sky that we're seeing past the opening in the ceiling there. So what happens is that as you sit below it, the sky is constantly changing, and the lights also change. They transition from one color to the next. And so there are a couple features, you know, that I've kind of come to associate with light and space. And one is the gradient, you know, and the gradient is, in terms of color or tonality, you know, is a common theme. You know, you see it in Peter Alexander's, you know, poured, you know, resin works, and you see it in the use of light with Terrell and some of the other, you know, light and space artists. And that's a feature that I've also latched onto, is this shift of tonal gradients or of color gradients, you know, that I think can be manipulated through through color theory and through the apparatus of perception. And so in this, when we're looking at the Terrell piece, the sky appears to change color relative to the color that we're seeing projected up into the sky space, the structure. And so that's one of the things that I've been playing with, is that you know, our perception of color and our perception of space is not static. It's very relative to what we see around it. And so through color theory, you know, you can get certain things to recede in space, and you can get certain things to come forward. And so some of my pieces in this body of work, they play with that tension of the figure ground space, and they appear to be coming forward and receding, you know, at different points in the paintings, depending on how you're looking at it.
Yeah, that's the slide I was looking for, Kathleen. Sorry. When you were speaking, I wanted to show this pair of images, because this is here in the showroom, this particular pair of works. And I think it was delight to, you know, actually install the work here and see this conversation about gradients and the inversion of the gradient here. And I thought that they were not pieces that I selected that I thought would be a pair, but they seem to work so brilliantly together because they do things in different ways. And what I think is so seminal about this body of work for you, and I've seen your work develop over 7 or 8 years now, is this sort of inversion. And I call it kind of a flicker, or a kind of a fluctuation. But what sort of seems to be the surface is both the, you know, the surface and the background. It's as if you're looking through into the piece, but also the optical quality of your eye, trying to recognize what's flat and what's deep, sort of constantly invert from one another. And it's like that photograph of the Terrell space, is that your work, you know, you when you see the sky, when you focus on the sky, the other surface seems like it's a flat surface. And then when you change and look at the surface of projected light, the sky seems like it's the flat surface. And in fact, the geometries, those cutouts, that cutout that was so prominent in the sky space photograph that we just shared, is very much like these sort of gestural, areas that you've almost seemed like you've removed, which aren't removals at all, are they?
Yeah, so the way that the paintings are constructed, it has to do with stacking a negative space. So essentially, I'm putting one background above another background, and the areas that are visible through the sort of gaps or the holes. At times they appear to be on the surface based on their chroma, their how colorful it is, or their tonal value. Dark things tend to recede, light things tend to come forward. And so I'm building up these contradictory spaces through manipulating these properties. And it is this process of seeing one thing through another.
I absolutely. This is, I don't know if everyone has seen this book, but it is by an art professor at New York University, entitled, his name is Joseph Lowe Carmel, but people call him Pepe, Pepe Carmel. And Pepe's, this is, a 2-inch thick monograph, and it's not arranged sort of in the way MoMA organizes the history of abstract art, as a chronological linear narrative or series of narratives, but rather, he has a take that says that there is no such thing as pure form, and all abstract art is rooted in experience of the real world, whenever and wherever art was made. And I find it's fascinating because he attempts to create typologies that characterize different approaches across time and space and across various different artists, of how they approach abstraction. And it's certainly a bold thesis. It's a very bold thesis, and it's one that I'm sure many people will have all sorts of questions and stake out all sorts of opinions on. But for instance, some of the categories are, for example, the body is one of the major typographies that he thinks of abstract art in relationship one is with. And then there's another one he calls landscape, which is then broken down into subcategories: vortexes, cliffs and waterfalls, waves, vibrations. And he uses the term open window as another one of these sub typologies of landscape. And that's, in my mind, your work in this particular body work kind of resonates with that. And you can think of a Rothko, and you can think of a Jewel Ilitsky, or something of those lines, which has these kind of atmospheric colors and light to them. But I'm curious for you, Chris, how do you see your work in the terms of the history of abstraction? Where do you see yourself fitting in all of that?
It's the more I've thought about that question, the more I see a sort of inherent paradox that we're in right now. And I think I kind of position myself sort of, kind of in the middle ground between a number of artists. In terms of ethos, one thing that I think back to is the relationship between abstract expressionism and then hard edge painting. And I think we have a slide that shows, Franz Klein next to a Carl Benjamin. And when I was in grad school, I would go over to Carl Benjamin. He's a Claremont local and a former professor, late professor from Claremont Graduate University. And he was involved in the hard edge painting school. And he would pull out paintings for me, and we would talk. And one thing that I noted is that all of his brushstrokes were completely straight up and down, completely vertical. And it was with this, what he told me was that he wanted to control the way that the light hits the paint, so that there would be no distraction from, the pure form. That was the best way to control the light. And you know, I asked him about the relationship between his work and the abstract expressionists, which were working at, you know, around the same time. And he was saying that their mark making was, it was a much more personal and much more emotive method of making marks. And so, you know, we're looking at the Franz Klein on the right part of the screen here. The mark becomes a sort of signature. And in Carl's mind, that was a very sort of ego-driven position, you know, to be basically, you know, putting yourself into the context of this painting in such a strong way. And whereas Carl, his attempt was to remove himself as much as possible. And as I started developing my painting style, what I started thinking about is how do I take the sort of what I consider a humble ethos of Carl Benjamin, this idea of not overemphasizing one's own position in relation to the painting, but still create a much more dynamic and active space that is much more akin to the abstract expressionists. And so what I found and what I've developed is this way of working in which I do the strokes and the gestures similar to the abstract expressionists. But then through this process of removal, I actually remove myself back out of that process. So it has to do with putting on wet paint, working around the wet paint, and then squeegeeing off the wet paint, and leaving the negative space that's left. So in a sense, I'm removing the individual aspects of the mark, you know, and that mark standing in for the signature of the artist. And it becomes this process where when you look at the edges created, and when you look at the shapes that are created within the work, you know, it almost looks like it is not done with a brush or not done with a hand. It almost looks like mechanized in some way. But of course, it's all a process of me layering and painting.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And and that is one of, I mean, we put this little video clip in there just to sort of bring you really close to the surfaces of your work, because it's indeed the surfaces that I think are so fascinating. Is, you create something that, again, in my words, flicker or fluctuate or draw you from layer to layer. And I'm always in your work, I am always challenged as a viewer to sort of figure out like what sits on top of which, what's below, what's the lowest layer of what I'm looking at, and what is the surface layer, and what are the intermediary places between those. And I often can't ever figure that out, quite frankly. It's kind of a mystery to me. Maybe we can have the next image here. Is that, I think that, is that, for me, this is a project you recently did up in San Francisco. And as I was thinking about like the open window, I was thinking about like how beautiful this installation is of these two large panels, which are on aluminum, and so the paint and material is reflective, and this is a different material than what you're using here in the exhibition. But was this project in any way sort of influential to you in your development of this new body of work?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I've learned by working on aluminum was that if aluminum is not reflecting, then it's like a gray value, right? Kind of like a mid gray value.
Mm-hmm.
But when aluminum is reflecting, then what you're seeing is you're seeing the light reflected. And so even if you have white painted on top of that, the aluminum that is reflecting appears to be brighter than white. And so there's this process in which the aluminum changes position relative to what's on it. And it also shifts in light. So if it's in natural light, it's going to act one way. If it's nighttime and it's completely lit by the interior lighting, then it's going to reflect and bring out different aspects altogether. So some of the gray values that you see in the work, in particular the blue piece on the right, has to do with this process of the way that I noticed aluminum changing depending on the lighting conditions. And I thought, is there a way to do that with paint? And rather than I still enjoy working on aluminum, but is there a way to just do that with paint? And what I found is that I can do that with the value of the paint. That the darker colors will recede in space, and the lighter colors will come forward. So I can get that sort of transition that I was noticing and that I was enjoying in the aluminum paintings, but building it out through just the use of paint.
Thank you for sharing that. And this is one of the areas you just saw on the slide. One of part of the exhibition we have up. There are 5 works in our project space here at the Lavin showroom that we're featuring right now, and we have a couple other pieces of your work up. This is I think one of the gems of the show, and I wish people could really see this up close and closer, but it to me is a perfect piece to sort of talk about what you use for materials, and again, maybe get a little bit more detailed into the processes that you use to make the work, which is so distinctive for you. You're using materials that look very conventional, but they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So for the last several years, I've been using UPO, which is a synthetic material. It to me, it doesn't relate that much to paper, but for lack of a better word, it's kind of like a paper. And it has a very silky surface that is non-porous and doesn't absorb water. And so what it allows me to do is it allows me to lay down layers of paint, gestural painting, and then I have a certain amount of time that I can work, while the paint is wet. And if I move really quickly, then I can remove the wet paint and get it almost all off. And if I let it sit for a few 3 minutes in the winter and maybe 2 minutes in the summer, then I can leave part of the interior components of the paint that I've put on will adhere to the UPO, and then the wet components will squeegee off. And so there's this time-based component that I've come to rely on that will help me determine, and it is an estimate, it's an imperfect art, but it will help me determine how much of the paint that I'm laying down is going to actually stay on the surface and how much of it is going to be removed completely. And so through this process of laying paint down, spraying with an acrylic-based spray paint around it, and then sometimes using brushes and water and manipulating the paint in other ways. And then when I've made those decisions and I feel like it's the appropriate time, I squeegee off everything that's still remains wet. And at times I'll spray it down with a water bottle and I'll wipe it off. And because of the non-porous, smooth surface of the UPO, I'm able to get quite a bit of the paint off. And so my paintings are this process where I'm putting on quite a bit of paint, and then I'm removing 60 to 80% of it, and then I do that again and again. And so the surfaces are deceptively they're not thick, they're not built up, but there's actually and some of these paintings have 10 to 12 layers on them. It's just that most of the paint is on my studio floor.
Not very efficient, Chris.
No.
Not a very
No.
efficient process whatsoever. But the sheer result of your work is kind of thrilling in that regard, and it is, again, as this little detail maybe shows, it's as if you see this wipe, you see that kind of abstract gesture, the movement of the hand. You have been involved in moving something across the surface, but it's thin and it's veiled and it has this translucency, and forgive me, but the color correction on this video clip isn't quite perfect, and it is just radiant color. And then there are these other places that look like splats or splotches or kind of a gesture, but they almost look as if, to me, I always feel like, did he take tape and pull paint off of it, or did he, you know, like there's something, you know, it's as if you've pulled something off and it's removed like a kind of, but there's pigment there underneath. It's not the surface underneath of the, you expect that pink veil to be underneath the red surface, but it's probably the other way around. And
Yeah.
that, again, it kind of like push pull is so fascinating to me.
Yeah, you know, intuitively, looking at a lot of my paintings, you know, with visitors, um, oftentimes I'll ask them, you know, what order do I think, or do they think that that things are done in, and and quite frequently it's the reverse of what they think. So you know, it's almost like I'm putting these paintings together backwards, and you know, because of the process of you know, leaving these negative spaces, so that what ends up appearing on the surface is oftentimes you know, the original layer,
Hmm.
and then I subsequently paint in the background.
Hmm. It's almost like how a printmaker might have to work a little bit
Mm,
in that
yeah,
regard. Yeah,
yeah,
interesting.
definitely.
Interesting. Um,
Mhm.
can we have the next slide? Uh, you know, one of the things about your work that is so salient to me is the color, and uh, that vibrant blush, almost magenta pink that we just saw, and then of course this composition, which is one of the highlights of the exhibition, which, you know, has this whole gray, black and white gray radiant going on, but then there's these, you know, brilliant purples and teals and ocean blues and lime greens and yellows. And you know, this, you know, I'm how do you compose your color systems, Chris? What's going on in your mind when you're doing that? Even the pieces behind you, you know, have
Yeah.
systems, themes.
Yeah. Well, one thing you know, this is just sort of a personal preference, but I don't like to stay true to any particular color system. You know, and so I like to be adventurous. So, you know, so sometimes I'll challenge myself, and I'll think of a color scheme in my head, and I'll think about, you know, in this one, I really wanted to go for these, you know, yellows and greens, and this almost kind of peachy kind of coloration. You know, and then as I'm working, you know, I'll build in, you know, I'll build in some of the other colors as sort of supports for those main primary colors. And so it's a challenge because you know, you know, I love blues. You know, you can see behind me, you know, I've got some paintings that are blues and grays, and you know, the blue and orange with the complementary colors. But I'll start off with this idea of the main color scheme in my head, and the overall structure of the painting, and then I get halfway into the painting, and you know, this is eh, this is a process that's partially controlled. I understand how the paint is going to work, and I understand the relationship between the colors, and I understand how the process is going to work. But sometimes there's an aspect where you relinquish control. You know, I don't know exactly how much paint is going to be lifted up when I squeegee. You know, as I'm working, I'm basically laying down a whole layer, and parts of it will be completely removed. And so I have to keep in mind, you know, what are the relationships that are on the surface, but what are the relationships going to be when I remove the wet parts? And so it's this process of building. So sometimes more paint comes off than I think, you know, than I think it you know, would have, and so then I make adjustments, you know, and so it's a process where I'm, you know, I'll do a layer or two, and then I stop, and I look at it, and I analyze it, and I see, you know, okay, you know, is this moving towards what my vision is, or is this, you know, do I need to make some adjustments? And so that's sometimes when I'll add in additional colors to complement the you know, the colors that are happening. Um, you know, but for the most part, you know, I've got a preconceived idea of the color scheme before I start the piece.
Hmm. It's interesting because I've always kind of pushed myself to question, you know, is it, you know, there's so you're so right about there being so many different kind of color systems, and And yet what I find, and I kind of want to get intellectual about it, but then I also kind of realize that you're a painter who gives us something really sensual and visually a delight to watch and look at, and I think the complexity of what you create with these and how magical the surfaces layer and are mysterious in that is something that it creates a work that one can always go back to and look at again and look at it again and look at again and experience it in a way that has a pleasure to it, and it's like a great book or a great movie. You can go back to it over and over and play with it and see it in a little different light, or the light that hits it is going to put it into a new realm of experience for one. And I think that vitalness is something that I think is so characteristic to the best of your work. I want to ask you kind of a question that as we look ahead is, what as an artist is, you work in series, you're constantly innovating your systems and your practice. What are you looking ahead to right now in the art world? What are you looking to ahead to in your practice? What's exciting you?
Well, one of the ways that I look at my paintings is that I'm thinking about the sort of the digital world, and I'm thinking about the relationship between these images that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, and how sometimes with my paintings, they appear to be an image. They appear rather than an object. They're sort of deceptively imaged and sort of dematerialized in a sense. And so I'm thinking about that materiality. And if you imagine there's like a division between the real and the virtual, and there's this imaginary scrim that divides those two. And to a certain extent, I've taken my paintings up as close to that, that barrier without pushing through as possible. And on the flip side, I've made some digital works that are purely digital, and lately I've been influenced by artificial intelligence, that I want to make sort of painterly. And so these two processes are coming together at this sort of division line between the virtual and the real. And I think that that's a really interesting place to be at this particular time, because so many of us are experiencing the world, through this sort of projected light, through our phones, through our, Zooms and screens, and we're co-managing our personal lives in the real tangible world, and we're also managing our avatars in our various social media accounts and everything else. And so, I'm influenced by the way that we're integrating technology into our life, and how that's changing the way that we deal with our natural world, how our perception is changing from from just being based on what we see in the organic world, and what we're able to sort of create in the digital.
Absolutely. Well, and it's one of the things about your work that also fascinates me is they if not being a window on the world, your work is like a window onto the screens that we are all gathered around these days. There is a kind of illumination and reverse illumination to the work, and we've talked about this in your work for the last couple of systems that you've created. And I encourage people to look at your Instagram feed, because you've been posting these really fascinating little animations that are coming out of artificial intelligence, and thinking about how one image can merge into something else, which merges something else, and you're creating that using tools and systems which are altogether new for artists. It is a whole new toy box of tools and opportunities, and in fact these are becoming a couple years ago, I was with a company here in Southern California, in Los Angeles, called Standard Vision. And Standard Vision, if you know them, if you look at one of these buildings that have sort of LEDs across the surface of the building that's emitting light, this was something that, 3 years ago, 4 years ago was like just beginning to introduce, and we're seeing it more and more into the built-in urban environments. And we're seeing how art is being used. These are oftentimes now part of art components that are being used for public art, and it's a completely new and different way of thinking about places for imagery and places for an artist to intervene with. And I'm curious, have you explored any of that?
Yeah, I definitely have. And I've, there's a whole thing going on right now with NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens, and they're sort of unique items that can be tracked through the blockchain. And I've done some releases in that regard. And right now I'm thinking about it's interesting to have these objects move through the digital world, but I also think there's a component of getting them out there. How do I get them onto a much larger scale into real life? How do I have the confrontation with the work is show up in places that are not just on a screen, they're on your phone? How do we sort of integrate those things? How do I take digital into the real life, and then vice versa? Um, and with the paintings, one thing that was in the back of my mind when I was making this series of work is thinking about this idea is how do I create work that appears to be sort of self-generating and yet falling apart at the same time. It's almost though it's sort of shedding itself, and so there's this quality of the paintings that that it looks like a painting was at one state, and now it's transitioning into another state. And I think that partly goes back to the Turrell and the light and space, and how how you never see a light and space piece that's exactly the same on different days, because of the light is different, the sky is different, the time is different. You're never going to catch it exactly at the same moment.
As we wrap this up for people today, and I've just received a text from somebody who asked me a question, and I want to make sure I get to that. We also have the chat open, and we're happy to take questions there, but I'm going to answer. Somebody asked me, how do I go see the show? And I thank you for texting me. And I want to just be able to say that the Pacific Design Center is open, and the Lavin showroom is open Monday through Friday from 9 to 5 essentially. And that the team here practices social distance, and it's an incredibly well facilitated and careful place for visiting. And so I encourage people to reach out to me or to anybody at the Lavin team to schedule a visit, or just text me and we can set up. I live in West Hollywood, and I'm always happy to visit with people here. So and it's interesting to me that people come and visit us here. So please do make time and effort to come and see the work and see the other artists in the other larger exhibition that surrounds us here. So don't hesitate to reach out to me through the gallery or through Thomas Lavin's showroom. So please do that. Are there other questions, Thomas? I'm curious what's been the response of the work from people visiting the show?
People are totally inspired. I think that Chris's sense of color is like none other. I mean, I was just fascinated as we were watching the slides go by, how dynamic the color stories are. And and while they look really wonderful on the screen, they're so much more vivid in person. So I really encourage people to come in. But the response, people are very excited. There's something about the work that fills people with joy. And I think it's particularly evident coming out of this sort of cycle we've been in, which has been so odd, that people can come in and they're just immediately made happy by the work. And as you guys were talking about, they're also confounding, because people are trying to figure out, well, how were they made? Which part came first? How was it done? Including myself. So they're almost like a brain puzzle.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, and Thomas, you have quite the eye yourself. So I'm actually really pleased that you actually have said that, because we had that conversation. And when somebody who really knows painting looks at these and can't figure that out, I'm always like, I like that. I want to be challenged by something that I don't understand, because my eyes aren't giving me the full story. And that's really, it shows the inventiveness and ingenuity of of Chris's practice as an artist. It shows the vitality of that, and that he's creating something here that it is kind of he has an unmistakable hand in that regard. I know Betsy just checked in about the Fremont Tower. Tell us a little bit about that project, Chris, that installation that popped up on the screen briefly.
Yeah, so that was a really fun project. I was commissioned by 181 Fremont for 3 paintings. 2 of them are in the downstairs, the elevator lobbies. So you round this corner, and all of a sudden, they're 11 and a half feet tall by 8 feet wide. So they're pretty considerable paintings. And there's a blue one, and then there's a kind of a red orange one. So one of them is really, warm, kind of hot colors, and then the blue is sort of a little bit more calming. And what happens is there's quite a bit of aluminum that's either still showing or that is not completely obstructed by the paint. The paint is translucent. And so in those paintings, I'm really thinking about light. How do I play with light? How do I play with the color theory versus the materiality of the aluminum to get it to change? How do I make paintings that transition? And part of the thinking behind that was that the location in this building where they are is going to get a lot of traffic at a lot of different times. And I thought, for somebody who has to walk by it every day, Instagram is headquartered there. So, all these Instagram employees, and how do they walk by it and find new and interesting things each time they walk by it? And so part of what I came up with was this interplay with the natural light versus the interior lighting, and what would happen with the reflection.
And I want to say that Chris, you, Thomas, and I have been working with one of the designers based here in Los Angeles, who commissioned you for a piece that builds on that typology of aluminum.
Yes.
And I'm really excited to see. I'm actually installing it on Monday, and I'm like so excited to see it finally in the space. So I'm like,
too.
I cannot wait for this client who's just fallen in love with your work, and she wanted to have something of architectural scale, and I'm really curious to see what it's going to do. Erica asked a question about another a project, and I think this is, if I'm correct, Eric, I might be mistaking this, but you are associated with a very famous glass company, and you're asking about large-scale architecturally integrated glass. Have you ever worked with that material, Chris?
No, I haven't, but I mean that seems like a logical path to follow, because again, I'd be dealing with these translucencies and this light reflection and layering in a way that I haven't before.
Mm-hmm. I think they would be marvelous to see. I mean, if indeed this is the company I'm thinking about, out of Munich, mayor of Munich, they do processes that are just phenomenal, and I could see how you could play with those layerings in very, very interesting ways. Our dear colleague Jeannie Denholm, who works with Thomas down at his other showroom, has asked about exterior works. Have you ever worked on the outside of buildings, Chris?
I've done a little bit of mural work. I was hired by the Montclair place in their sort of reimagining the plaza here in Montclair, and I was tasked with creating a mural with some of my students at Chafee. And so what started as what I thought was going to be a 20-foot by 20-foot mural turned into 145 feet long, and I employed some similar tactics, that I use with my paintings. These gradients, and what it is it's this mountainscape, and I'm using gradient color, and then I'm going over top of it with this linear quality. So there's this translucence, but I've also had to kind of reformulate this mural because I was tasked to work with students from the community on this. It turned out to be a really interesting project, but most of the time I'm working on interior projects and in my studio.
Well, and our dear friend Alex Rasmussen up in Santa Barbara who I'll be seeing tomorrow doing an installation, is asking, he's inviting you up to Santa Barbara to go visit the factory up there. So you should definitely go explore some of these materials that people like Alex are working with. I mean, I think your work is such a natural bridge. The paintings are fantastic and singular and joyous, but I can see where the idea of your work going in other places and other technologies could be really beautiful. It could be very phenomenal.
Alex, I'll reach up to you because I'll be up there in a couple weeks.
Great, I'll connect you guys. I want to just say to everyone who's joined us, it is just an honor to have all of you join us. Thank you for hanging in there through all of these crazy times. I know Thomas and I really look forward to welcome you to the showroom here. We have not really had the opportunity to have an art reception here, and I am really up for that very soon, hopefully.
Yes.
So we miss all of you, and we want to welcome you in whatever way you feel comfortable to join us here and to reach out. And just know that that Thomas and I are looking at some amazing projects coming up. We've invited a Berlin-based artist, Matthias Ryerson, in to do an exhibition with us following Chris's work. I have a couple of projects that are on the table that are going to be amazing, and we'll be doing a major reinstallation of the gallery of the showroom here in the next month or two. So we'll be keeping you advised and noticed on all of that. So thank you all for your support and for your patronage and for your joining us. Thank you for visiting with us. And this talk will be recorded and put up on our Instagram television channels, and you can join us there. So until we have this opportunity to do it again, I want to thank Thomas and I want to thank Chris for doing this, and for the entire team. And there's Amy. Thank you all for making this possible for today.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate you joining us as well.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Be well, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and good luck with getting those shots. Okay. We want to see you back here soon. Okay. Ciao.